crowd will grow as it does each week. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome each and every one of you to our Wednesday reflections, the time when we gather as a community to one, both engage to significant and pressing issues as we journey and work toward building a better society and world for us all, and a time that we can connect with one another and be support for one another through these difficult days. We are very excited today. I will be giving a fuller introduction, but what I will say at this point is we're very excited to have with us Reverend Amanda Tyler, who's the Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, and our very own Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva, who is the Rabbi Herman E. Schallman Chair and Professor of Jewish Studies and Senior Faculty Fellow of the Interreligious Institute here at CTS. So I'll give a fuller introduction, but I just want to say now how excited that we are to have both of them join us today for a critical conversation about Christian nationalism. So I'm going to turn now to Lisa, I think, to do our housekeeping, and then we will begin in earnest.
Thank you, President Ray. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see so many of you here this week. Just a reminder of a couple of things that will help us to better enjoy our conversation. If you are not speaking, please keep your microphone on mute so we can avoid some background interference noise and listen to one another more fully. Also encourage you to open up your chat window. There's a speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. Click on it and the chat window opens up to the right side. Feel free to send messages to individuals or to everybody to make ongoing comments, even while in real time as our speakers are sharing with us, to toss questions in the chat. It's a great way to stay engaged. There will be a time of Q&A to engage with our speakers today. And during that Q&A, you can unmute yourself and speak, or you can put questions in the chat. So some great ways to be able to stay engaged. Also encourage you, I know that the Zoom meetings allow us to multitask and eat lunch and be doing all kinds of other things, but if you're able to turn your camera on and be an active face here, it's really wonderful. And for our presenters especially, it's nice to have a room full of faces and not just names. So if you're able to have your camera on and be engaged that way, that would be excellent. So again, thanks everybody for being here. Special thanks to our guests, Reverend Tyler, and also to Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva for being here. And President Ray, I'll turn it back to you for intros.
Okay, so now I want to give a full introduction to both of our speakers, and then we will invite them to a significant conversation around specifically issues having to do with Christians against Christian nationalism. So I begin with the introduction of, once again, Reverend Amanda Tyler, who is the Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. She leads the organization as it upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion, and protecting against its establishment by government. Tyler often speaks in churches, educational institutions, and denominational gatherings, and she provides commentary on church-state issues to the national media. She serves as the co-host of the BJC Podcast, Respecting Religion, called a powerful advocate and rising star in the sector by the Nonprofit Times. She was named one of the nation's top 50 nonprofit leaders in 2018. Tyler was named Baptist of the Year by ethicsdaily.com in 2019 for her work leading the Christians Against Christian Nationalism initiative. And our very own Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva, who, as I had said, is the Rabbi Herman E. Schallman Chair and Professor of Jewish Studies and Senior Fellow of the Interreligious Institute at CTS. Professor Mikva served as a congregational rabbi for 13 years before returning to academia. Her research and teaching focus on interpretation of the Hebrew Bible in various times and places, exploring how the ideals both shape and reflect the societies in which they unfold. She is especially interested in the intersections of exegesis, culture, and ethics. And I invite you now to a conversation, and I invite all of us who are gathered to join with gratitude for the significant conversation about the struggle against Christian nationalism, which is both the practice of bad religion and actually a blight on us all at the end of the day.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. I'm so excited that Amanda agreed to join me in conversation around this question. It was very much Christians Against Christian Nationalism that inspired me in my writing my own piece in the public square around Christian nationalism, and that gave me courage to do so. And Amanda is an amazingly thoughtful and courageous spokesperson around these questions. And so we'll talk with each other a little bit. Amanda's going to share some slides at the outset to present some basic information so we're all on the same page, but we'll leave plenty of time for questions, your questions and conversation at the end. So think of them or even write them into the chat so you remember them as we're going along. So Amanda, let me turn it over to you to share with us a little bit about what is Christian nationalism, what do we mean by it, where is it showing up, and why you think it's important for people of faith, especially Christians, to be challenging it.
Oh, thank you so much, Rabbi Mikva, and thank you, President Ray, for having me and for the introduction. I am going to share my screen here. Hopefully you all can see this. And we're just going to go over, I think it's important at the outset to talk about what Christian nationalism is. And my colleague, Josiah Masters, is joining us today. He is actually the person at Baptist Joint Committee who coordinates the Christians Against Christian Nationalism project. And he is going to be putting in the chat as I present some links that might be helpful for you all to engage. This might be the first time that you've heard of Baptist Joint Committee or BJC and our work protecting faith freedom for all. And so I just have here some of our social handles as well as our web address, and would encourage you to learn more about our work. And Josiah is going to put in the chat a way that you can subscribe to get our emails if you'd like to stay in touch with BJC after this. But here's a working definition of Christian nationalism. It's a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. It suggests to be a true Christian, one has to be an American, or to be a real American, that one has to be Christian. Of course, we reject this understanding, and we also see it as a threat not just to us as Americans and American pluralism, but also to Christian religion. Here are some of markers of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism relies heavily on a mythological founding of the United States as a, quote, Christian nation that has been singled out for God's providence. Some might see Christian nationalism as an exaggerated form of American exceptionalism. There's also some similarities with Christian nationalism with civil religion, or ways that we see religion in the public square. It is not a total overlap, and we'll get to some of those distinctions as we go along, but there are certainly some connections there. I do want to say what Christian nationalism is not, and Christian nationalism is not exactly like Christianity. As we said at the outset, Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework. It is not itself a religion. The Christian in Christian nationalism is really more about identity than about religion. It carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. And Josiah is going to put in the chat a one-page resource that Christians Against Christian Nationalism has put together, which is called What is Christian Nationalism? And it goes into more of this identity and how Christian nationalism actually impacts views on different public policy issues. Now, I do want to say some people will say Christian nationalism has nothing to do with Christianity, and I don't agree with that. And that's because Christian nationalism actually uses the language and symbols of Christianity. And in some circles, Christianity itself and Christian practice itself has been so confused with Christian nationalism that it can be difficult to tell the difference. And we're going to get into some examples of that as well. Christian nationalism is also distinct from patriotism. And I have found that sometimes when people are responding to Christian nationalism, they respond somewhat defensively about, well, what's wrong with being a patriot? And I reject Christian nationalism and I embrace patriotism. Patriotism is a love of country, and there are all kinds of ways to show your love for country. You can salute the flag, you can protest in the streets, you can stand up for your First Amendment rights. There are lots of different ways to be patriotic. Nationalism, on the other hand, is an allegiance to country that demands supremacy over everything else, including our theological convictions, and for Christians, including allegiance to Jesus. And so, I say if your version of patriotism causes you to sacrifice your theological convictions, then that's not really patriotism. That's trending into nationalism. And that's how we can distinguish these two things. Christian nationalism is actually something that's being studied by sociologists of religion. And there are a couple of there are many people who are studying Christian nationalism right now, but I rely heavily on the work of Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who wrote a book in 2020 called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. And in their polling work and their survey work, they have questions and they ask people, how do you strongly agree, somewhat agree, disagree with statements like these, that the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, the success of the United States as part of God's plan, or the federal government should advocate for Christian values? And based on responses to polling questions such as these, as well as in-depth interviews, Whitehead and Perry have actually come up with 4 different orientations of Christian nationalism. They've divided their research subjects into 4 categories: rejectors, resistors, accommodators, and ambassadors. And I'm just giving you a real thumbnail sketch of this. And if you're really interested, I would highly recommend the book that they've written on this topic. But as you can see, the American public is really, somewhat evenly divided among these different categories. And so I point this out to say it's often more helpful to talk about Christian nationalism as an ideology rather than try to identify certain people as, quote, Christian nationalists. Because as we can see, about 80% of the country in some way is connected to Christian nationalism in some way. The rejectors are the ones who are most, who have most soundly denounced Christian nationalism, but it is an ideology that has been pervasive in the country for generations, for centuries, and so one might expect that it shows up in a lot of different ways. In that way, Christian nationalism, I think, has a lot of similarities with racism. And so when we talk about Christian nationalism, I think we also have to talk about white Christian nationalism. In the Christians Against Christian Nationalism project, we've dealt with this topic with this statement, that Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. Why is that so? I mean, I think part of it is the history, because Christian nationalism relies so heavily on this mythical founding of the United States as a Christian nation. We can't separate the history of the United States from a history of slavery and racial subjugation. And so one might, see from that the idea of Christian nationalism itself is so firmly wrapped in that history and in racism. And it also, because it so heavily relies on this identity aspect, so much of that identity, as I pointed out earlier, has to do with nativism and fear of other. So some of this language gets coded when they talk about the kind of Christian nation they're talking about. They're really talking about a white Christian nation. And like I said, just like Christian nationalism is pervasive, racism is pervasive. It touches every piece of our society in the same way Christian nationalism does. And so there are quite a few points of connection here between the two topics. Just to quickly go through some examples of Christian nationalism that I think might help inform our time together. There are some really obvious examples of Christian nationalism, most recently January 6th, and there's still, I think, reporting and fact-finding coming out about this. There might be some talk of this when the January 6th Commission at the Capitol continues. I think there will be some conversation around how Christian nationalism showed up in the symbols that were present there at the Capitol. And in the hands of violent extremists, Christian nationalism can definitely turn deadly. It did so at the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in October of 2018. It did so at Mother Emanuel AME Church in June of 2015. And I think these are the examples of Christian nationalism that get our attention, that are quickly denounced, and they are important to denounce because of the scale and severity and the terror that Christian nationalism can cause. And we can't be so distracted by these obvious forms of Christian nationalism that we don't take notice of the more mundane, everyday kinds. And here's an example. This is from a public school wall in South Dakota from a couple of years ago. That's when the South Dakota legislature passed a law requiring every school, every public school in South Dakota had to have the words "In God We Trust" prominently displayed on the walls of their school. And this is a bill that came out of a legislative package called Project Blitz, that was a legislative package heavily influenced by Christian nationalism, trying to pass laws in schools that would further this ideology. Here's another example of Christian nationalism. This is called the Bladensburg Cross. It's a 40-foot cross that stands in Bladensburg, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. And the American Humanist Association challenged the constitutionality of this cross. It went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld its constitutionality, and I don't want to get into all the specifics of that, but whether it's constitutional or not, I think this is absolutely a form of Christian nationalism. This monument was meant to stand for all American service people who had died in war. It sends a signal that everyone who would defend this country would be Christian. And in order to defend the constitutionality of this monument, the government was actually claiming that this was a secular symbol. That was an argument that the BJC stood against at the United States Supreme Court. We stood with Jewish groups who said, absolutely not. This is a Christian symbol, and to declare otherwise is offensive to both Christians and non-Christians who can all see that this is a Christian symbol. But that's what can happen to Christian symbols when they're appropriated for Christian nationalism, to stand in for nationalistic symbols. And finally, final example of Christian nationalism is perhaps the most controversial in a lot of churches and other houses of worship in this country. You'll see an American flag on the altar. We think this is an example of Christian nationalism because, again, it's equating our citizenship in the kingdom of God with our citizenship in the United States. It's putting them on equal standing. And we at BJC, again, we're just putting out information. We just want to start questioning some of these assumptions that are underlying Christian nationalism. Not saying rip every flag out of the sanctuary, but maybe some of these congregations, just think about it. What kind of symbol is this sending? Why is this important to our religious practice to have these examples of our national symbols in our houses of worship? And we have some resources at BJC, including an oldie but a goodie resource on American flags and sanctuaries that continues to be one of our most downloaded pieces because people are curious about this question. So, BJC has been involved in raising questions about Christian nationalism for some time. And in July 2019, we launched the project Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We did this in an ecumenical way with a number of other religious groups and leaders who were concerned about this project. And to date, we've had more than 22,000 Christians publicly sign the letter, and even more important, use our resources that we've put out, including discussion guides and one-pagers and things like that. And so this is the end of my presentation, but I will say it several times today. If you're interested in taking a public stand against Christian nationalism, this is an active project, and I hope you'll go to christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org and get more information and add your name. So with that, I look forward to being in conversation and to your questions.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
So yeah, we are. Now everybody's back. So can you talk a little bit about once you decided that BJC should get involved in a formal campaign, the strategy for building that campaign? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I really was kind of reflecting on this recently about how this all got started. As I mentioned, we launched in July of 2019. Several months earlier, we were coming off of, we had another kind of national, sign your name of support initiative around at BJC around standing up in protection of the Johnson Amendment, a tax law that protects houses of worship and other 501c3s from being co-opted by politicians. And we'd had some good success there and in our legislative advocacy. And we thought we knew we could do something like that. And so we kind of followed that model and wanted to do a similar thing about Christian nationalism. We always, in doing our work, we default to interfaith work, and not just interfaith work, but also working with secular partners on things. And so when we started thinking about this, we got some of our traditional interfaith partners together around a table and said, what do you think about doing something, standing up, really trying to raise awareness around what Christian nationalism is? I mean, I think that's one thing, is now it's becoming more of a known term. Two years ago, it really wasn't in the lexicon like it is now. So we really just wanted to define it, raise awareness, and highlight it as a risk to not just to Christians, but to others. And our partners said, we love that idea, and we think you need to be the ones to do that. And so we quickly pivoted to Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We are deliberately exclusive, not out of an exclusive mindset, but because we own this as a problem that is most acute in Christian circles and that has impact for all of our neighbors.
Right. So Catherine Stewart's book, The Power Worshippers, tries to look at Christian nationalism inside a broader case for the rise of religious nationalisms around the globe. And I think that there are important intersections there, but was terribly grateful that there was a Christian address to say there are Christians doing this work, that this is not an assault on Christianity. And I have to say that as a Jew entering the public square with a critique of Christian nationalism, some of the blowback I got was, America's been wonderful for the Jews. How dare you say anything, against America? So I wasn't really critiquing America. So, it can be useful to have that more exclusive voice, prominent voice out front and center in this campaign. So what have been for you some of the blowback that you've heard, or some of the obstacles as you're trying to build the campaign?
Yeah, so when we launched the blowback, and it wasn't, we didn't have a big media announcement. We decided to just put this out into the world and see what kind of reaction we got. And we had, I believe it was, we had thousands of signatures within the first 10 days, and it was always meant to be a grassroots kind of movement, that this would be something that people would sign and then share on their social media. We have all kinds of tools on the website to allow people to do that. They can change their Facebook picture to say, I'm a Christian against Christian nationalism. There are all kinds of ways to spread the news with their neighbors. And so that happened. And those who took issue with our campaign, including those in Christian circles, also noticed and came back. And I think there was a real defensiveness immediately in some of the words, like, as kind of saying, well, don't call me a Christian nationalist. Of course, nothing in this campaign does that. We don't point fingers. If anything, we're pointing fingers back at ourselves and saying, let's examine how Christian nationalism is at work in our institutions, in our communities. How can we better understand this in order to try to dismantle it and its hold in our communities? And they also would say, well, this is just a way of you trying to push us out of the public square. And again, then we could point back, we anticipated this, I think. We anticipated some of the arguments in a lot of ways. And the centerpiece of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism initiative is a statement of principles. And the very first principle is that people of all faiths and none have a right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. And so we are not trying to push anyone, including those who most actively embrace Christian nationalism, out of the public square. We're just trying to offer an alternative view of Christians who have concerns about Christian nationalism. So the fact that our asserting ourselves in the public square would elicit that kind of response shows how much I think Christian privilege is kind of at the heart of this, or this sense of a loss of Christian privilege. They also would say, well, isn't this really about just a set of left-wing progressive policy positions? You're just threatened by the positions that we have. And the Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement doesn't touch on any hot button political statement or issue. In fact, it's written in such a way that we hope will unite people who have different views on a number of moral concerns, issues that come to us at the ballot box, or that our local officials consider, that no matter how we might come out on those difficult moral questions, that we share a concern about how Christian nationalism impacts our neighbors and also impacts our theology. So there has been pushback. I will say that January 6th, I think, caused people to look at this issue in a new way. I think the scale and severity of the attack on the Capitol, it makes it, I think, a little bit more difficult for them not to examine Christian nationalism and how it's at work. Again, I think the danger is that we focus so much on
Only
just
on that violent
eradicating
expression.
exactly,
Right.
and not ask some of these other questions, including questions about religious freedom for all, which again is the centerpiece of our work at BJC. Right. That how that interacts with Christian nationalism.
Right. Right, and that danger of sort of only focusing on the violent expression of Christian nationalism was what I was writing about, that we have to look deeper at the broader dangers and engage our self-critical faith, which is, of course, my stump speech around self-critical faith these days. But you mentioned something I just want to lift up, and then I want to talk about the statement some more, because I do think there are some really interesting theological assertions that our community would like to dig into for a moment. You were talking about, Christian privilege, which is something we do talk about at CTS. But the sense when one is losing one's privilege, or when one's privilege gets, there are efforts to dismantle it, right? One's privilege gets challenged. It gets interpreted as an assault on their identity, right? This happens with white privilege and white supremacy, right? So that and the effort to dismantle and challenge white supremacy or white privilege is seen as an assault on a person being white. So too, Christians are, even people who we wouldn't necessarily think of as identifying with Christian nationalism, get very defensive that Christianity is somehow under assault, right? We see this coming a lot out of people who do identify with Christian nationalism, but even sometimes people who don't. And that's really just because the privilege is being highlighted and challenged. So one of the things that the statement says is that conflating religious authority and political authority is idolatrous. That's a very powerful statement. You want to unpack that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think this is directly relevant to some of the more recent examples of Christian nationalism that we've seen. And before I go into some of those recent examples, things that we said at the time of launch and continue to be true is this was never about President Trump. I think there were a lot more examples of Christian nationalism front and center during his presidency than maybe in more recent years. But Christian nationalism is an issue that predated his presidency by centuries and continues after it. But I think one of the examples, but the project did launch during his presidency, and a theme that we saw then and was very much at play on January 6th was this idea of a messianic significance of his presidency, of people talking about Donald Trump as a savior. His campaign manager, in fact, at the time called him a savior for the United States. And we found that as Christians deeply troubling, that any political figure would be equated with a savior or a Messiah was idolatrous, blasphemous, heretical, all of those really strong words, but that were becoming very commonplace and really debased the religion in many ways and confused it. And so we thought from a theological perspective, it was very important to point that out, to, remind people of Jesus's words of render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render unto God the things that are God's. So that this confusion and this merging of our political and religious authority was really at odds with our religion, and also had ramifications for pluralism and for equality of all Americans, regardless of their religious affiliation.
You had said something earlier too, when you were talking about, I'm trying to remember, the way in which, if the nation itself becomes your God, right, becomes your ultimate concern, then you do things, you make decisions based around what you think that, it will advance the welfare of the nation, that Trump, no pun intended, I
Right.
guess, your religious commitments, right?
Right.
So, and this is how one of the ways in which militarism becomes wrapped up with Christian nationalism and somehow presented as religious value, where in fact, there are clearly powerful counter voices within religious traditions to challenge militarism as well. So,
right. And I think that was when I was kind of distinguishing between nationalism and patriotism.
right.
And, if we go back in history, we certainly have examples, long ago examples of Christianity being changed and using scriptures to justify slavery, to justify Jim Crow segregation. And then we saw many of the same arguments coming up in light of George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement. And again, this idea that that if your theological, convictions caused you to stand up for racism, if that caused you in some way to be critical of your country, that was unpatriotic. So we saw some of these same examples of how if your allegiance to countries causes you to sacrifice some of your core theological convictions, how it's your religious convictions that are harmed in the end, and the religion itself.
There are some great questions coming up through the chat, and I want to invite folks who pose them to actually unmute. I see Melvin's question first. You want to unmute and ask it?
I surely can. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. So as you were talking, I was thinking about Elizabeth Wilkerson's cast, The Origins of Our Discontent, and how she makes the very solid case that America is a caste system with the demarcation of one group of people over another. So at its core, caste system seems to me to tie into Christian nationalism. So my question was, um, in your view, does Christian nationalism relate to caste, and if so, how?
Really wonderful question. And I will admit that the book is on my stack and I haven't made it all the way through yet, but your question is inspiring me to return to it as soon as possible. I've heard just incredible things about the book and I've enjoyed her prior work. I do think it's related to caste because I think that there has been, and this gets to Christian privilege, I think that there has been an unspoken, perhaps, caste system of Christians being put at the top of the pecking order of the country for generations. And again, there are all kinds of myths told about the founders of the country and about their religious convictions. I think sometimes they are portrayed as more religious and devout than perhaps many of them actually were. But I think some of that that continues to present day, where you will look at the makeup of the United States Congress, for instance, and as a body, they are much more they profess to be much more religiously devout than the country as a whole. Let's just say that people who are religiously unaffiliated make up a much smaller percentage of the US Congress than they do of the US population as a whole. And so I do think that there continue to be, particularly in some communities in the country, there continues to be a preferential place given to people who claim a Christian faith, whether they're actively practicing that or not. I'd love your thoughts on that question, Rabbi Mikva, as well.
Well, I think, yes, and more fundamentally, we the people never meant all the people at the outset. And to some extent, Christian nationalism is still trying to privilege what we the people meant a couple hundred years ago. And to recognize that while, the freedom of religion, both the free exercise of it and the
no establishment
clause of the Bill of Rights in the First Amendment didn't apply to the states, right? And so, in fact, states did have religious castes as well, and not simply that Christian versus non-Christian, but you had to be the right kind of Christian in particular states. So I do think that there's clear residue from those caste structures that Wilkerson is talking about that are playing out in religious caste today. Yeah, I think that's all I would add.
Mm-hmm.
Tariq, you want to jump in? I see a question about flags.
Yes, how are you doing?
Good.
So my question was, with respect to religious nationalism, how is the presence of the American flag in American houses of worship different from the presence of the Israeli flag in American houses of worship, or Pakistani flags in American houses of worship? And as a ... is that I recall that President Trump at one point, using this identity politics in his version of it, cast aspersions on Jewish American citizens who are against his policies as they're somehow being disloyal to Israel, right? So that's why I'm asking this whole confusion of and utilization of these identity politics.
You want to jump in first, Amanda?
I'll jump in first, but I'm not. I think I won't speak much to the Israeli flag. I will say why I mention in particular the American flag is the context of of Christian nationalism and the definition that I gave, this merging of our identities as Americans and Christians. And, from the first piece of that is to be a good Christian, one must be American. And, Christianity being a worldwide church, I think many houses of worship have gone to having many, many different flags in their houses of worship. I go to First Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., and that's what we have. We have flags from all around the world hanging in the sanctuary, and that shows the worldwide nature of Christianity in that way, and not limiting it again to an idea that is so wrapped up in Christian nationalism of a special providence for the United States as a cultural entity, that God favors us above all other countries in the world and gives us that nationalistic view. So that's why I think the presence of the American flag is particularly harmful. I can imagine if some of the same parallels are given with other flags, you might see some of the same issues. It's just not my frame of reference or context.
Well, it's interesting because the history of flags in synagogues, because historically we never had flags in synagogues, but in the 19th century in the United States, Jews started putting American flags in synagogues in order to demonstrate that they were American, right? In order sort of as a challenge to anti-Semitism and say, you don't belong here. We too are Americans. We are proud Americans. We are patriots, right? It wasn't wrapped up with nationalism. It was to try to demonstrate patriotism. So then after the state of Israel was established in the 20th century, in 1948, there was a slow accretion. If we're going to have this flag as part of who we are and our identity, should we not also assert the Jewish state as part of our identity as American Jews slowly became to more broadly support the presence of the state of Israel? And I think that I actually read something a long time ago about various minoritized communities, immigrant communities, putting American flags in, and then sort of more post-civil rights era and claiming of ethnic identity that it liberated, then would add another cultural flag as a matter of identity markers. So they are related in that they are identity markers, but I think every different community has its own story of what, why and how it comes to mark. I see you have other questions in the chat, Tariq, and they're good ones, but we'll jump to some other folks and then come back to you if there's time. I can't quite figure out who Gary is.
Well, that may be me. So yeah, it has to be, I guess. I'm exploring different seminaries, and so Deneen invited me to this podcast. So, but my question,
Welcome.
well, thank you. Do you find this to be more of an issue with the conservative theological mindset versus liberal progressive mindset?
So I think that, and the researchers will show that there might be more people who identify kind of in the ambassadors of Christian nationalism in more conservative or fundamentalist religious circles than in more progressive or mainline circles. But their research really shows that it's across the board, that this isn't really an issue of just people on the theological or ideological right, that this is something that kind of shows up in all communities in the United States, in all regions of the United States, in all different kinds of houses of worship and all different race and ethnicity backgrounds. And so I think it's a mistake to say that this is only an issue of the, quote unquote Christian right, only an issue of Trump voters, however you want to kind of, define that. but it shows up differently in these communities. I mean, it's a complex ideology, and so kind of understanding and noting it and where it comes up, helps to have conversations around it.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Amanda.
Sure.
So I published my op-ed in USA Today because I wanted to sort of reach that middle space, right? Not the New York Times crowd, but the folks who probably, if you ask them and they hadn't had Amanda's great introduction to what is Christian nationalism and why is it potentially dangerous, would kind of assume that it means, gee, I would love America to live up to my Christian values and and through that kind of mindset, I think, become accommodators, right? Sort of people promoting Christian values in the public square, not necessarily distinguishing those that are really privileging the deep religious values versus those that are conflating religion and political authority, or undermining religious pluralism in the process of promoting your values. But there is, I think we have to recognize there's a kind of a natural, yes, and this is part of the critique that came back at me, like, well, you're promoting your values in the public square, right? There is this kind of natural tendency to think, well, wouldn't America be great if everybody lived up to, my highest values? Including myself, but America as a whole. And I think that that's a kind of a natural thing that we have. And so to live in the space of difference and to recognize that there are values that you want to be able to enable people to live by and through that might not exactly be yours is a second level thinking about how we live with difference in America. And I think that more complex work is what BJC is trying to do with its broader campaigns around religious freedom for all.
Yeah, and I think that's beautifully put. And I would say there's a difference between advocating, like you or I advocating in the public square and bringing our religious selves, and then between that and asking for a religious government, right? That we're calling on the government itself to legislate our Christian values or pass things from that perspective. Whether it be allowing, government sanctioned and led prayer, in our public spaces, including our public schools, and all of those issues that continue to come up, even though the Supreme Court ruled long ago on those issues.
Right. Ed, you want to jump in?
Thanks. My question really kind of, I think, has to do with definitions. You've been talking about Christian nationalism, and I'm curious how that relates or compares and contrasts with evangelical Christianity, and maybe even terms like conservative Christian or traditional Christian.
Yeah, I think that I think they're distinct. And I do think in some circles, right? And and maybe, and I'm not even like, I'm not in a broad brush, like some congregations, some individuals, that their Christianity, their concept of Christianity has been so impacted by Christian nationalism that it's difficult to tell the difference between the two. But I don't think, and in fact, we have many signers of our statement who would identify from a more conservative Christian perspective or an evangelical perspective, who are deeply concerned about the impact of Christian nationalism on the religion, on both the religion itself and how it is viewed from the outside. And it's that motivation that is causing them to speak up against Christian nationalism itself. And we've seen, particularly again since January 6th, we've seen even more interest in this topic. And there's a group that's organized that really have organized kind of evangelicals against Christian nationalism. And we have some overlap, and we're coordinating with them. It's not a rival group. And when they wanted to do it, we said that'd be great, to have an even smaller segment of of Christians who are really wanting to shine a light on this. And so there's an effort going on there. And I've seen even more recently some Asian Americans who are Christians who are standing up against Christian nationalism. So many of whom probably, would identify in a more conservative space. So, so I think there are some very prominent examples of conservative Christians, including like Robert Jeffress of First Baptist Church in Dallas, who is very much about Christian nationalism. In fact, had an entire Sunday devoted to America as a Christian nation. Has allowed the sanctuary to be taken over by Christian nationalism in a lot of ways. But I still think, though it's very prominent, that is still somewhat of an outlier in evangelical and conservative Christian circles.
I think it's important to remember history here, which is we've been so framed by the recent decades of evangelical political activism, but before that, they deliberately stayed out of politics precisely because of their concerns that sort of entering the sphere of Caesar, right, would distort their Christian commitments around the ways that they wanted to live their lives and shape their communities. And I think that even though the face of evangelical Christianity is often very different now than it was back in the 70s, there's still that consciousness in substantial segments of evangelical Christianity, and worrying about the ways in which this political stuff is really distorting their Christian values. And it actually is leading to a younger generation where you see, when you make common cause with evangelical Christians around climate change, for instance, or around poverty work, it's often younger generation who says, well, my Christian values, right, not the political values of white evangelical Christianity in America that's been defined by the religious right for the last 20 years, but my Christian values teach me that I'm a steward of creation and that I have responsibilities for people in my community and beyond, et cetera. So, anyway, I think the historical, the dynamic there, right, it's not a static thing, is important. Dr. Ray, we're going to give you the privilege of the last question.
Thank you. So my question is, when we look at the rise of Christian nationalism on steroids here in America, but then also religious nationalism around the world, are they filling a void that's been left by the dissolution of geographic and cultural empires, i.e. European empires, et cetera? So are they stepping in to fill the void of empires that are dissolving in the midst of our time?
I think it's a really fascinating question. I will say that my work has been so focused on the United States, and when your question started, I wondered in the American context, like things that have kind of devolved or in the process of kind of waning influence. I think about the influence of churches, and I think about the waning church membership and how many people who ascribe so heavily to the Christian nationalism, some of them are involved in church and some of them aren't, and this seeking for the government to somehow take the place of that cultural institution that the church played in many places. And I will just say the question of empire itself, it's not one that I've really reflected on. So I'm not sure how Rabbi Mikva, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, thinking in the context of the United States, I do kind of intuit, without necessarily having data or study to back it up, but that there's that the sense of potentially waning power of American empire is one of those catalysts that makes Christian nationalism seem more urgent to those who are sympathetic to its goals, right? That it's a way of continuing to say, no, this is God's intent that we should rule over the world. And so, yes, it's linked that way. And trying to think globally around religious nationalisms, I do wonder if also, as I think the question suggests, that some of the uncertainties introduced by transnational issues and the dissolution or the attenuation of identities is exacerbating that desire for sometimes transnational religious nationalism, if you will, right? So whether we're talking like ISIS, right, can work outside national boundaries to recover some broader divinely ordained sense of right to govern religiously, but also in the individual, and the rise of religious nationalism inside Israel as part of this global phenomenon of rising religious nationalisms. And it has, again, its own contextual history, but part of it is clearly around that sense of, well, what would Israel be if it actually empowered all of the Palestinians living here and enfranchised them? Then, that sense of it would attenuate the identity is driving some of the religious nationalism. So, but some flammable constellation, that's not a good connection, some flammable mix of religious identity, national identity, and the dissolution of empire, attenuation of identities and dissolution of empires have to be involved in this global rise.
And I would just add, that kind of inspired me thinking, I think in the American context, just how much pluralistic and diverse the American population has grown in recent decades has also fueled the rise of Christian nationalism. And that's borne out in some of the studies, and how fear of immigrants and refugees is very tied up with high rates of Christian nationalism.
Mhm. Well, thanks to you both for a wonderful and provocative conversation. It is so timely and so important, so thanks to you both. I'm going to turn now to Kim Schultz, who has our announcements that will close us out.
Thank you, President Ray, and thank you both of you. Fantastic discussion. Just real quick before we leave, there's still lots of amazing things happening event-wise around CTS, and I just want to draw your attention to two of them right now. One is on April 15th, we have the annual Public Square Lecture with Kamal Sinclair, and she is a future architect. And you can look that up if you want to learn more about that, or come on April 15th to find out more. She's a storyteller, and she's going to be talking, and I think it's a really unique event. She's going to be talking about the stories we tell and how that makes our reality, and how by shifting the stories, the reality shifts. And I think that is connected to her architecting. So I think it should be a pretty interesting lecture at 3 p.m. And the link just went into the chat. And the other one I want to draw attention to is the IRI. The Interreligious Institute just had a fantastic event with Wajahat Ali last night, our spring lecture. That is going live on YouTube if you missed it and you want to hear his really amazing.
Very funny.
And so funny. Laughed. Rachel, we're just laughing. It's hysterical. So if you'd like to check that out on YouTube. And the IRI is also during Ramadan, doing Ramadan Quick Talks, which also will feature our very own Rachel Mikva. Dr. Mikva is one of the guests, and every week during Ramadan, the IRI is partnering with Lutheran School of Theology and American Islamic College to do 10-minute chats over lunch every Thursday during Ramadan about Ramadan, engaging in interfaith dialogue. And as I mentioned, Dr. Mikva will be one of our guests. So stay tuned for that. And am I passing it to Emily?
Sure. Thanks, Kim.
Okay.
And I hope you'll consider logging on next Tuesday, April 6th at 5 p.m. Central Time for a lecture that is part of our Open House Lectureship series. The Open House Lectures are a longstanding CTS tradition in which our faculty selects PhD students to present their research. So this lecture next Tuesday will be given by Zach Selby. He's a current PhD student and soon to be alum who just successfully defended his dissertation. And he'll be delivering a paper called The Violent Harem: Spatial Transformations of Class Status in the Book of Joshua. It should be interesting, and I hope you can make it.
Okay, well, once again, friends, thank you so much for joining us, and we invite you to join us next week as we gather again for our Wednesday reflection. So once again, thank you to Reverend Amanda Tyler and to Dr. Rabbi Rachel Mikva for being with us. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Loved being with you all.